Hello, welcome back to my channel and the final part of my Michael Powell retrospective. And today we're talking about the one masterpiece that Powell produced after he left his partnership with Emmerich Pressburger. And that, of course, is Peeping Tom, one of the most exhaustively written about films in world cinema. Because, of course, it's about cinema. It's about the act of watching. It's about voyeurism, the morbid desire to gaze, as the psychiatrist in the film puts it. And so there's been endless film studies essays looking at how the film talks about how cinema works, all that kind of thing. Now, I don't want to rehearse those arguments in this video. You know, there's plenty of essays and in-depth analyses of Peeping Tom you can find online in every university film studies library. God, it gets boring. I really want to talk about this film in relationship to Michael Powell's career. Now, of course, you all know the legend, I'm sure, that this was the film that ruined Michael Powell. Ian Christie, probably the best critic of Michael Powell, has argued that this isn't true, that it's a bit of a myth. I'm not so sure that I agree with Ian Christie on this. I think it did ruin Powell. It got terribly bad criticism in Britain, you know, where people absolutely lambasted Powell and thought he'd made something perverse and sick. And it ruined his reputation amongst critics. I think it also ruined his reputation in the industry. People were a bit cautious about working with him again. Had Michael Powell gone off the boil, had he gone a bit wrong, you know. And the films that he made after Peeping Tom were nowhere near as good as his previous work. You know, he went on to make a few more films in England. He went on to make a couple of films in Australia. But none of them captured the old Powell magic. This was the last time. What I want to look at in this video is why did the British critics hate this film so much? We often hear this legend of how they were outraged by it, but no one ever asks, really, what was it about Peeping Tom that really upset them? Because after all, this was the same year that Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho came out, about another sick man, a serial killer, preying on women. In that film, a woman gets killed in a shower. What's the problem? Why did one become a new modern landmark in cinema and the other one was felt to be depraved? Well, let's look for some clues. When I first saw this film many, many years ago, I wasn't sure about it. It struck me the wrong way. I was a bit off-put by that strange piano score it has, that sort of, you know, it's unusual to have a soundtrack composed by one instrument. And it's a very sort of insistent, troubling score, though I now think that actually helps the film. But the thing that really bothered me about Peeping Tom, I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I realised what it was. It was made in '59, and it came out around the end of '59, 1960. But it feels like a post-war film. It feels like the London of the 1940s. It feels dated. And that sort of disjuncture bothered me enormously. It was as though Powell had not moved forward. He was still the Powell of Powell and Pressburger in the 1940s. He was still living in that world. He hadn't brought himself up to date. Now I find that anachronistic quality of the film adds to its creepiness and I quite like it. But when I first saw it, it kind of bothered me. And that's a clue, I think, to where Peeping Tom really upset the critics. You see, because Powell didn't change his style. Here he was making a lurid film about a serial killer killing women by stabbing them with a tripod, you know, like an erection, a sort of, you know, symbol of an erection, into their throat while filming that, you know, they can see their own face of fear. Pretty sick stuff. But he didn't change his style. He made it in exactly the same way, in exactly the same tone and register as he'd made his 1940s films, with whimsy, with humour. Check out the start of the film. We have that opening sequence where he's filming the prostitute going up to the flat and he kills her. After that, it's gag, gag, gag. A policeman comes up to him and says, "Well, do you work for a newspaper?" And he goes, "Yes, The Observer." Boom tish. Then he goes to the newsagent shop and he's filming those girls. And one of them says, "Hurry up, love, I've got to see my boyfriend. And I don't want my fiancé to find out." Boom tish. The whole movie is a series of gags. It's a black comedy. So the scene where Moira Shearer gets killed, right? He moves her back into the trunk. She falls in. He kills her. Immediately on the soundtrack, you hear, and that's the end of today's news. Bumtish. Then the body of Miyashiro is found in a comic scene. They're filming this comedy film in the studios. This rather ditzy actress asks for them to pull the trunk out. They open the trunk, there's the body, she screams. And the director says, "Oh my God, she's fainted in the wrong scene." Bumtish. It's one gag after another. And then that poor actress is brought back for another joke at her expense, at her trauma. She was the woman who found the body. Now they replay the scene, this time using hats instead of trunks. And again she faints. And again we're supposed to laugh at the exasperated reaction of the director. So Powell's whimsical humour that you found all the way through the 40s films is being transplanted into a horrible, lurid story of serial killing. Now let's go back to Psycho by Hitchcock. Hitchcock was taking very new material here. He starts the film with a couple just having sex in a hotel room bed. He's watching a woman in a normal office stealing money. He's going to watch a serial killer. So what he did was he went black and white. He went to a TV aspect ratio. He deliberately sort of scummed down his filmmaking. He went away from the great big expansive filmmaking of North by Northwest. And he came down to a more televisual, stark style for this new kind of horror story that he was telling. He deliberately changed his style. But Powell didn't. Powell just kept on as if he was making, Gone to Earth or Black Narcissus or Matter of Life and Death. He was treating this lurid material exactly the same as he was treating his old wartime propaganda material. And that was his great mistake. You see, imagine if Psycho had been made in the same way as North by Northwest. Expansive cinemascope, beautiful colours, lots of set pieces, and lots of jokes and in-jokes, like the train going into the tunnel at the end. Well, that kind of joke is all the way through Peeping Tom. The second point is this. Peeping Tom is not just about cinema, it's about people who watch cinema. All the way through, Powell makes jokes at the expense of film critics, right? There's even a reference to sight and sound. So this young lad holds up a still of a gorgeous model showing herself off and says, "You don't get that in sight and sound." Well, these critics are turning up to these screening rooms to watch preview prints of Peeping Tom. It's almost rubbing their face in it. Powell casts himself as the abusive father who abuses Mark in his childhood. Incidentally, those scenes are so powerful. They're the most powerful moments of the whole film. Far more powerful than the murders, which Powell treats quite lightly, actually. But the scenes of child abuse, with his father experimenting on him, are extremely disturbing. And Powell casts himself, this director, he equates himself with the director of an experiment, a sadistic experiment. He's almost saying cinema is sadistic, right? And we go back to the camera as weapon, as a gun. There's a shot, for example, when the police come to Mark's flat and he smashes open the window, and one of the policemen says, "It's all right, it's only a camera." And the police inspector goes, "Only a camera." Powell is presenting cinema as dangerous. One other point worth noting is that the script explicitly equates film and prostitution through the red light, the traditional symbol of the prostitute, and the red light above a studio door that says, "We're filming." Mark says to Moira Shearer, "I've put the red light on, no one will disturb us." So there's all these kind of double entendres and double meanings in the dialogue. But there's something else. I used to do film criticism, and I used to go to press screenings, and many of the press screenings are in screening rooms in Soho. Now, Soho has been gentrified now. It's full of vegan sausage shops and Pilates classes. But back in the day when Peeping Tom was made, it was full of massage parlours, girls on the street going, "Hello, love. Fancy a bit of company? I can dress up as a dirty schoolgirl for you, or a nun." That's the world that these critics would have been going out to when they were coming out of these screening rooms. And I went to those screening rooms, and you know what? They're a bit tatty. They're a bit seedy themselves. One of them, you went in through this doorway. I think next door, a couple of doors along, there was an opening to a prostitute's door. And you went downstairs into these kind of grubby screening rooms. And it just brought home to me that this is the Soho in which Powell sets his film. And this is the world that these critics would have been going out into. And that's also important because of the third reason I think this film bothered critics so much. You see, the word erotica is an often abused word. Some people think it just means posh porn, which I suppose to a certain extent it does. Pornography is straightforward. It's watching the act of sex. Erotica is taking it into art, isn't it? It's the nude. It's drawings, tasteful drawings of the naked body or whatever. Peeping Tom is not porn and it's not erotica. It's something else. The very title gives it away. Peeping Tom, a phrase that you don't hear anymore. Blokes who like to watch girls, try to see them undress. It's a very British style of prurience, isn't it? It's the saucy seaside postcard. It's page 3. Lovely Tina, 19's. Got a couple of things on her mind. We've got a couple of her things on our mind. I mean, this is the world of Peeping Tom. Think of that wonderful opening sequence in The Newsagent, where wonderful Miles Malleson, that old character actor, comes in and says, I hear you've got some views. And then he's looking through these views and he's buying them with his Daily Telegraph. Come back again, sir. You know, it's all that kind of stuff. It's wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's Eric Idle in Monty Python. You almost expect Les Dawson to turn up in Peeping Tom going, whoo, boobs, nookie, whoo. You know, it's that world. Now, that world is not the world of the middle class intellectual. It's not erotic. It's not beautiful. It's not Monica Bellucci and Romain Boringer in that 90s film L'Appartement, where they're wonderfully nude but also quite chic and sexy in a Parisian apartment. No, it's backstreet massage parlours. It's prostitutes' numbers on post-its in phone boxes. It's that kind of world of Cynthia Payne, you know, and the suburban orgy. It's that cheap, tatty, very British world. It's because the film is so British in that sense that I think the one criticism I would make of the film is the casting of Carl Burnham, who is outstanding in the film. He communicates Mark's anxiety and his strangeness and remoteness so well. But the thing is, he's Germanic. And because it would be much more impactful if he was British, part of this prurient culture, because it would make it more of a unity. Because he's Germanic, he already stands out anyway. He already seems strange, which I think slightly goes against what the film is about. But that's the only criticism I would make of the movie. But there's something else that I think bothered those middle-class critics, those intellectuals. And that is that it's really a scene right at the beginning of the film that I think sets the tone for the whole film, and those critics really didn't like. He goes upstairs above this newsagent where he's got an extra job filming young girls in the nude or taking saucy pictures. One of them, the camera gorges on her whole figure. She's wearing a sort of cowboy hat and not much else. And then she turns to camera and she's got a hair lip. I don't think they're called that these days, but that's what they were called back in the day. And Mark, the main character, looks up in wonder. He's suddenly taken with her. He's fascinated with her because of her imperfection. And here, something new and unwanted comes into British cinema. Perversion. The ghost of Bunwell and his fetishizing of legs and heels and prosthetics. It's something you don't find in British cinema up to this point, and not often in world cinema up to this point. And there it is, bang, straight in your face in one of the very first scenes. This fascination with something that is not traditionally sexy, not traditionally orthodox and allowed, but something of a darker undercurrent. And that darker undercurrent flows through this film, but done in the same jaunty, whimsical style that Powell had made all his other films. So I think we're beginning to understand why British critics reacted against this film. But of course I think they were wrong. I think it's an extraordinary masterpiece. We should mention two of Powell's collaborators. First of all, we must mention the scriptwriter, Leo Marks. Let's be honest, without a good scriptwriter, Powell fails. Once he lost Pressburger, he was never the same again, and this was the only time he was partnered with a really good scriptwriter. And Leo Marks is so important to the success of the film. He was a fascinating figure himself. He worked in cryptography during the Second World War in an agency, the SOE, that was very similar to the agency that David Farrar works for in The Small Back Room, a rather sort of ramshackle bunch of experts working in cryptography, supporting agents and resistance members on the continent. So he brings that experience to this film, and I think he writes a brilliant script, laden with double entendres, both sexual and metaphorical. The other person who I want to mention is the actress who plays the blind mother, Maxine Audley. She is incredible. And the two scenes where she meets Mark are the great scenes of the film. They're the heart of the film. The first one, watch out for the first one when he's first introduced to her. There's a little effect that I have never seen discussed in any discussion of this film. As you're going into the scene, a veil is lifted from the camera. This is one of many sort of meta-cinema devices that Powell employs through the film. So you get to the end of a scene and you'll hear cut, and then you'll transfer into a film studio, or a film light will go towards the screen and then you cut. One of my favourites of this is you see the blind mother pour herself a glass of whiskey, and you cut straight away to Mark upstairs filling some developing fluid into a flask, linking their two obsessions in one edit. Very, very clever. But in this introduction to this scene where they first meet, you see a veil lifted, and this is like, it refers to her blindness. The veil is being lifted as she comes to see Mark and understand him, meet him for the first time. But it's also like a veil of the story, that this is the moment where he will really be discovered by someone else. And then later you have that fantastic scene upstairs when she confronts him upstairs in his cinema. Take me to your cinema. That's my favourite line. And there's also that wonderful line when she says, the blind live in the rooms above their heads. I've been in this room many, many times. The dialogue is brilliant. The dialogue, acting and direction of that scene is just superb. And the wonderful fact that he can't kill her because she can't see. She can't see her face in fear, so he can't bring himself to kill her, which is never outlined in the script, which I like very much. There are so many brilliant touches from Powell in this film that show that he still was a master of cinema. My personal favourite, which is using one piece of direction, one gesture to sum up an entire life. And it's that fantastic shot where Mark runs his fist along the row of books written by his father, which were the results of the experiments on his young son. And he runs his fists along and punches them in. And that gesture just sums up his whole life. And that's a brilliant piece of direction. I also love the bit when he has his first kiss, Anna Massey kisses him on the lips, and immediately he transfers it to the lens of his camera. That's a brilliant touch. The film is full of these wonderful touches. The pencils falling through the air. You know, as Mark is filming the investigation and the pencils fall almost in slow motion. A weirdly beautiful shot. This is Powell at his finest. The film is about the camera, right? And the camera is a double instrument. It's an instrument of science, of recording, of data, and it's also an instrument to produce fiction. And I love the way that Powell introduces that idea so simply and subtly and succinctly in the very first scene. So the film opens, it's a street at night, lit like a fiction film, very beautifully lit. We go up to a lady of the night, outside a shop window. A camera clicks on, we're looking through the camera and we hear the whir of the camera. So we're in a fiction being filmed like a documentary, like a scientific instrument filming a fiction. Then we have the murder scene. Incidentally, in the murder scene, the little detail, the detail that gets to me every time I see it, when they go up to that crappy little flat, she turns the electric fire on. What connotes the misery of prostitution more than that? Going up to a horrible cold flat and turning the electric fire on. Anyway, so they go up, they have the murder sequence, and then immediately you cut, and now you're watching the film as a found artifact. This fiction now becomes an object that we just watch objectively without any kind of involvement. The fiction has turned into a document. And so in that way, you know, that dichotomy of camera as scientific instrument and camera as agent of creating fiction and fantasy is brought together right at the start of the film, very simply. I think that's quite brilliant. But in the end, despite all the brilliance of this film, the English critics rejected it. At one point in the film, Anna Massey says, "I want to understand what I'm shown." Perhaps they just didn't understand what they were being shown, and that's why they rejected it. And perhaps they didn't understand why Michael Powell would want to make this film in the first place. I think it's an extraordinary film, and it's one of these films that genuinely I think gets better the more you watch it, the more you get used to its rhythms, the more you get used to that strange piano score, right? It gets better as you watch it. I think it's a masterpiece. Unfortunately, it was the last masterpiece. After this, Powell really did go into the wilderness. I thought about doing a video about one of his later films, Age of Consent, with James Mason, my favourite actor, and along with Jimmy Stewart, and a very young and very ravishing Helen Mirren. But actually, I watched it again last night, and you know what? It's not terribly good. The scenes between Mason and Helen Mirren are great, but the rest of the film is just awful. Powell never seemed to recapture it, his abilities. And I think in some ways, brilliant director though he was, he stayed trapped in the 1940s. He could never adapt to the new cinema of the 60s and 70s. And that's why after, the 60s, he never made another film again. So he ended with a whimper, not a bang, a bit of a sad end to a great career. But I think he's a fantastic director. And soon I'll be doing my ranking. You'll find out my top 10 films from this retrospective. But thanks for joining me through this retrospective. I've really enjoyed it. I've loved rediscovering the films of Michael Powell. I still think he's a brilliant director. I'm now going to be starting a retrospective on Claude Chabrol. So I hope to see you there for that. Thanks.